Well, I think I have to brag that I'm also the daughter of a mayor. So my dad served over 6 years as mayor of the small town of Onancock, Virginia. So also I'll say that and add my respect and appreciation for your work. But no, I think, Carrie, you've done a great job. We have a board member, Dr. Chris Nichols, who is a historian at Oregon State University, and he talks a lot about the ways that history can really surface patterns in the past, that when we look back and see those patterns, it helps us see them more clearly in the present. And, I like to say, hindsight is 2020. That's one of the great things about doing history. We can see that past more clearly, and it really does help us pick out those patterns in the present better. So we really appreciate y'all's willingness to come and pay attention and learn some of this history with us today. We promise we'll have a few high points, so not all bad. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can see the slides. I imagine folks are pretty accustomed to this sort of format by now. But here we have a brief overview. This is a wonderful photo that a friend of mine took a couple of months ago now at a protest down in Salem. And you can see the person there is saying, Oregon has a racist history, let's not have a racist future. And so that's a great way of thinking about all of the work that y'all are doing. We wanted to note that folks have available the chat function down in the bottom of your Zoom screen, or maybe located elsewhere depending on your format. So please feel free to use that. But we like to begin the talk by just asking folks about what are some of the myths that you think there are in history? What are the myths about Oregon or the United States that you would want to share? There's such a small group. You all can also feel free to unmute yourselves and shout them out if you like.
For me, the very idea that the Civil War was about states' rights irritates me to no end.
As it should. So
not exactly what they said in their declarations of leaving, is it? They
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else, some myths that you might think about? And
one of for me, this is Steve Calloway from Hillsborough, and one of my historical myths, not having grown up in Oregon, but being aware that it came in, when it came into the Union, it came in with a slave state in order to balance the, balance out free and slave states. And so again, my myth was believing then that meant that we truly came in as a free state with, with rights, privileges, equality, for, Blacks who live in Oregon or who wish to come to Oregon.
That's a good one. We're going to talk about some of that too.
And this is Mayor Gibson.
Yeah.
One of the things that I realize and I hear a lot, and in fact, Governor Roberts talked about it, was the migration, her family coming from Philadelphia, 6 months as pioneers and settling in Oregon and taking advantage of land grants. The myth is, I don't know if it's a myth or not, but the feeling amongst Blacks is that whites were given property, they were given land, and all through that period, Blacks were denied, restricted, and not allowed to gain wealth by owning land. And that definitely is a stark thing, and it's so common and it's so comfortable for white Oregonians to talk about that. That's how we got our start and as pioneers and were granted those land rights where for a long time, Blacks were not even allowed to be here.
That's correct. And
Yeah.
I see a note here from Michael that Dallas, and one of the myths was Dallas was the headquarters of the KKK in Oregon. And there has been this urban myth go around that Dallas was ground zero of the KKK, Dallas, Oregon, and here in Oregon. And the research we've done here at OHS suggests that while there may have been KKK members in Dallas, or certainly were, that somehow that it was the ground zero is probably not accurate. So,
I mean, depending on the time period in Oregon, the KKK had strong inroads in the governor's mansion and in all kinds of places. So I don't think any place in Oregon gets to claim that, but it is the kind of thing that becomes sensational, right? Yeah. I want to comment. Someone has asked the question that I want to answer. Did all women get the vote at the same time, or did the vote come later for women of color? And the quick answer is that all women did get the vote in Oregon in 1912, all women who had citizenship. So first generation Asian immigrant women were not entitled to naturalized citizenship per federal law at that time, so they weren't able to access the vote. The Indian Citizenship Act for Indigenous people wasn't passed until 1924. So there were many Indigenous women who didn't have access to the vote because of citizenship. And then in Oregon, as in other places, there were laws passed that on the face did not discriminate by race, but effectively did. So Oregonians in 1924 passed a literacy test for voting rights. And so that would be targeted at Indigenous people and also at immigrants from a variety of places. So that's a good question.
Well, I want to go to the next slide, Eliza, and we'll get started. And as we talk about some tough things to talk about, we also want to recognize that throughout Oregon history, there have been folks who have stood up for the right cause. And here's some. We honor Hattie Redmond, who was a Black woman suffrage activist who spoke. And there you can see from our record there, you can see the eloquent colored speaker, Mr. George Riley, they were talking about, a term they used back then. And on the right is then young state representative Mark Hatfield, who in 1953 sponsored the bill that required open housing, the accommodations in Oregon. When Senator Hatfield was a young dean at Willamette University, he brought some amazing Black Americans out to Willamette to speak, Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson. And he was shocked and stunned when there was no hotel between Salem and Portland that would allow these major national figures to stay there because they were Black. And they had tried for years to get open housing legislation, public accommodations through the legislature. It had failed. And State Representative Mark Hatfield in 1953 finally succeeded. Tomorrow would be the 9th anniversary of Senator Hatfield's passing. So thinking about him today as well. Eliza?
Yeah, and I think it's important to know that we're going to talk a lot about these oppressive pieces of legislation and patterns, and yet you see people standing up for justice throughout Oregon history. So this is a quote from the introduction to that special issue that Carrie held up, and this is Dr. Carmen Thompson, who's a lifelong Oregonian, who wrote the introduction for us, and it introduces people to the scholarship around critical race theory and the ideas of white supremacy and whiteness. And this I found particularly useful for me to be able to read about and get a better understanding of the ways that whiteness and white supremacy intersect with each other. So if you want to take a second to read that, but it's really fascinating to think for me as a white person about where that expectation of privilege might show up that I'm not even thinking about, that's just so subconscious from growing up in a place that has made the kinds of structures that enact and support white supremacy that we're going to talk about today historically. So.
And on chat, Eliza, there was a request that we post the slides when this is done. And I said, we'd
be happy to send those along.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have all kinds of resources available for everyone on our website. So there's a lot more. Any of this that you want to learn more about, we can get you the info. All right. The Oregon State Constitution.
1857, 60 delegates, and of course back then would have been 60 Caucasian men gathered in Salem to write the Constitution of the territory as we look to becoming a state. They wrote it and they sent it to a vote of the Caucasian men of the territory, about 10,000 of them at the time, asking 3 questions. The first question was, do you approve of the Constitution? Overwhelming vote, yes. Second question was, as has been previewed, was when Oregon enters the Union, should we enter as a slave state that allows slavery or a free state that bans slavery? And by about a 3-to-1 margin, the Caucasian men of Oregon voted to enter as a free state. But the third question was, should we allow Blacks in Oregon, period? And by an 8-to-1 margin, the answer was no. Excuse me, the answer was no. So Oregon is the only state in the Union that came into the Union with a constitution that actually banned all Blacks from living in that state. Something that continues to shock people today when they learn it, because everyone now sees Oregon as a progressive state. And the fact that we entered the Union with that in the Constitution, and it remained in the Constitution, not enforced, but remained in the Constitution until the 1926, when it was finally removed by a vote of the people. And you'd be saddened by how many people voted against removing it.
And I think, and that is, one of the most prominent exclusions in the Oregon State Constitution, but there were other exclusions written into the Constitution. OHS holds the drafts from the Constitutional Convention. And so you can see here the way that they have inserted the word white in their work to define who would be eligible to vote in Oregon. And so these drafts are really fascinating to read because they're a record of the deliberations, just like anytime you're cutting and pasting or using track changes on your documents. And the Constitution included restrictions applied to African Americans, Kanakas, which was a word used for Hawaiians that I understand can be seen as derogatory today. So be careful with that one, but it is used historically. Chinese people, there were many, many Chinese people living and working in Oregon in 1857. There were explicit exclusions there. Women, of course, all non-white foreigners. And many of these exclusions caused tremendous debate in the US Congress as they were trying to decide whether to ratify this Constitution and accept Oregon as a state. And so I think that that's another one of those myths that we think about, right? Oh, that's just how everybody thought then. Well, no, there were actually congressmen who said this Constitution really puts into stone the kind of racism that we don't want to see. And so the debate lasted quite a while. And then in 1859, that Oregon was brought in as a state. I'm sure everybody on this call knows that February 14th, 1859 is Oregon's statehood day. So,
and our first 2 U.S. senators who were sent back to Washington, D.C. to fight for statehood and then become senators when we became a state, a fellow named Delazon Smith, who was a newspaper man from Albany, Oregon, and then Joseph Lane, the first territorial governor, and then later one of our first senators. Lane, although Oregon had voted to enter as a free state, Lane was a notorious very ardent advocate for slavery. So much, in fact, that when the Civil War occurred, he sided with the South, with the Confederate States. That finally kind of brought to an end to his career. He came back to Oregon, retired, and lived out his life in Roseburg. But here was one of Oregon's U.S. senators actually in favor of the Confederates during the Civil War.
And there was one of the mayors brought up earlier this, the Donation Land Act and this land that was given away to folks here in Oregon. This is a huge part of the reason that Oregon had such a white population and continues to have such a white population. One of the other myths that's important for us to think about always is this myth of wilderness. We have all heard stories of pioneers or Lewis and Clark showing up in the wilderness. We are all in Oregon on land where peoples have lived for thousands and thousands of years. And so we really can't call that wilderness at all. And I'm sure many of you are thinking about land acknowledgements in your communities and who are the specific tribes and bands who have ancestral and ongoing relationships with the places where your communities continue to be. In 1850, when the federal government passed the Oregon Donation Land Act, it then justified the theft and giving away of native land to explicitly white people. And that's the law said, quote, every white settler or occupant of the public lands, American half-breed Indians included, above the age of 18 years, being a citizen of the United States or having made a declaration according to law of his intention to become a citizen. So that's the land, and that part about the half-breed Indians is in recognition of the children of retired fur traders and their native wives who were living here at the time, and many of whom were politically prominent. And so between 1850 and 1855, the US law gave legal standing to 2.5 million acres of native land that was given to these white settlers. And I think this piece of ephemera is amazing because here's a tax receipt. Here's one of the pieces of evidence that allows for that land to be taken. And of course, everyone knows that property ownership is a wonderful way to build wealth and to build generational wealth. So when we think about how these laws impact generations later, this is a big one, I think. All right. Judge George Williams. This is to go back to that 1857 Constitutional Convention. Judge Williams published a letter on July 27th, 1857, on the front page of the Oregon Statesman, and he laid out the argument for Oregon's becoming a state that was free of slavery, but that also did not allow free African Americans to live here. It's a really stunning piece of writing that's worth reading because it can be so confusing for people to think, well, how would a state enter as a free state, but an exclusionary state? And this argument really lays out how the vast majority of those voters who rejected slavery in Oregon were in no way opposed to slavery as an institution, and were in no way supportive of equality between African Americans, white Americans, and among races more generally. Carrie always does such a good job at remembering what the margins on the votes were.
8-1 margin is it's pretty stunning.
It's pretty stunning. And I think, one of the things that we note, you see here that Judge Williams makes an argument about the nature of Black people. And this is really drawing on, of course, the argument made by Thomas Jefferson and his notes on Virginia. And I think also one of the other things about the letter is that it identifies the fact that there were abolitionists here in Oregon at the time. So again, that sort of everybody thought this way kind of idea. There were actually abolitionists who were in favor of equality and in favor of abolishing slavery as an institution, trying to push politics here in Oregon. And Judge Williams had no patience for those folks. So it's a lengthy letter, but it's worth reading.
And when you put in the Land Donation Claim Act that only white settlers, not only, of course, eliminates Blacks, it also eliminates Asians. And anti-Asian violence and discrimination was very prevalent here in Portland and in Oregon. And one of the most famous incidents, you can see the Chinese Massacre Cove slide there, occurred over in Eastern Oregon, where Chinese miners were slaughtered. 34 Chinese miners were slaughtered. There was a trial, but nobody was ever convicted.
No, and I think we see during Reconstruction, there was a lot of work nationally in the United States to try and re-engineer who could be citizens. Obviously, that's what the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution is about. But also there was a revision to the Naturalization Act that happened in 1870. And it was, again, leadership from Oregon and the West, including our friend George Williams, who was a senator by that time. And they advocated for making sure that making sure that Asian immigrants would not be eligible for naturalization in that 1870 Naturalization Act. And they were successful in that advocacy from the West. So that restriction would not be removed until passage of the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. So, go ahead.
Right, just continuing through the timeline, you would see again the anti-Asian advocacy when it came to World War II, and with Oregon being one of the 3 states, of course, on the Pacific coast, that the Japanese American citizens, who were actually citizens of this country and citizens of this state, were forcibly removed from their property and into internment camps during the war, simply for the fact that they had a Japanese heritage.
Yeah, and that xenophobia was really the war in many ways was an excuse for the taking of that land and that property and those successful farms. Oregon passed an alien land law in 1923 that said that people who are not eligible for citizenship cannot own property. So there's complicated ways that citizenship and whiteness and property rights are tied together throughout Oregon and US history. There's a question on the chat I see about where that slaughter took place. They were killed on the Oregon side of the Snake River in Hell's Canyon. And their bodies washed upriver, I believe, to Lewiston, which is where people first became aware of the violence.
Because why were they slaughtered? They were slaughtered because they were
because they had gold.
They had gold.
They were gold miners.
They were competing against other miners, Caucasian miners, who thought the best way to get rid of them was to kill them.
I think they were a band of horse thieves, actually, who
So-
killed
so.
them and took their gold. Yeah, this is the Wild West that everyone hears about, right? All right. So labor unions, those bastions of liberalism, right? Not so much always, not so much. Labor unions did a lot of work in enacting racist policies and practices in the West, and particularly in fomenting anti-Asian violence, and also keeping Black folks out of unions during World War II. So that's what these images are about here. So there's a long history in the United States of wanting non-white labor, but not wanting those laborers to have citizenship or political rights. And just
Or the best jobs.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And just a heads up, keep your eye out for an opportunity to hear from the nation's premier historian on xenophobia coming from OHS soon. So you
The first large Black population in Oregon didn't arrive until World War II, when many Blacks came here to work in the Kaiser shipyards, the shipyards that would produce many of the ships that would help the Allies in America win World War II. Mr. Kaiser built a new town in Oregon, as many of you know, called Vanport, which is very much ahead of its time as far as the integration of neighborhoods and daycare for workers. But one of the reasons he had to build a new town was because there were so few places that where Blacks could live, were allowed to live in Portland. Portland was redlined, as many big cities were. There were just certain areas where the city fathers would allow minority populations to live. Vanport, of course, after the war ended, was famously destroyed by a flood in 1948, which forced the Black population that had remained there to find other places to live. And again, there were very, very limited options, which led to the vast majority being shepherded into the Albina district of Portland. And you'll see that coming next as far as housing discrimination.
I now just respond real quickly. There's a question about anti-slavery, or excuse me, discriminatory constitutions like Oregon's typical in the West. The constitutions of states in the West came at dramatically different times. Like Arizona didn't become a state until 1912, for example. The story that I have heard from Dr. Daryl Milner is that the Constitutional Convention for California was debating an exclusion clause on the final day of their constitution. They went to lunch, they had some drinks, they didn't come back and bring it back up for a vote. So it was certainly under discussion, but it did not end up in the Constitution. Many of the constitutions in the South were restricted free Black people from coming into the states. And there's really interesting scholarship on the connections between the Oregon Constitution and Southern constitutions and other laws and policies related to free African Americans. So.
And I see a mention of the late Senator Jackie Winters in the chat room. And Jackie, yes, was a child of Vanport and very proud of that, and told a lot of stories about it. We hosted her at events here at OHS when she talked about Vanport. And we have a great deal of material here at OHS on that remarkable place and time in Oregon history.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Mentioning the redlining, that the color code there, Eliza, means something, correct?
Yeah, it does. And the colors are the green, blue, yellow, and red. And these have to do with whether you could get the FHA bank loans for purchasing a house. This map was created in 1934. And this, as people are familiar with the term redlining, this is where that term comes from. So this discrimination in the ability to borrow money to purchase a home. And you can, these maps are available online. Somebody has digitized them and put them up. It's really fascinating to look for them, look and see if they exist for the town or city where you live today or where you may have lived in the past. I've looked up my neighborhood on this map, and it details the foreign born and also non-white folks who are in the neighborhood to give it a particular grade. So again, this is just lack of access to capital, lack of access to property ownership that compounds over the years. And I think for folks in Portland, you know, there's a lot of history about the taking of property in the Albina area. And again, what you see, so that's the area that's those big chunks of red that are there, and sort of the north and northeast part of the map, particularly that north part there is Albina. And then you had the Emmanuel Hospital expansion, the I-5 cut through, and other kinds of urban development that happened. So between 1960 and 1980, about 1,600 housing units were lost in Lower Albina. So again, just this opportunity to build wealth and sustain wealth and just have a stable community gets interrupted over and over and over again. The wonderful, oh, go ahead.
If you limit where people live, naturally that will impact where you limit where people can go to school. The people who live in a neighborhood, they're little neighborhood school. And so we see a slide here on education discrimination, which flows naturally from housing discrimination. Ron Herndon there is standing on the table. He's a longtime activist here in Portland, was the director of the Albina Head Start, and one of the many leaders in the 1970s and 1980s as they looked at the education discrimination here in Portland and the difference between the schools where Blacks children went and those where they didn't.
And so just to follow up on that question on the colors that I see in a chat, the best was blue, still desirable is yellow, or excuse me, green was best, blue is still desirable, yellow is definitely declining, and red is hazardous. And so is what those different colors meant. And they were intended to help folks who were providing federally backed loans for housing. So, and they were explicitly tied to the racial makeup of the neighborhood. So the colors were based on the racial populations of the people who lived in those neighborhoods. That's how they decided whether it was declining or desirable, that kind of thing. So
in Portland, like as we talked about education, like all rest of the United States, they had to respond to the integration requirements of Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s and did not necessarily manage it well. More Black kids were bused than white kids. It was creating, so the disruption was felt more sorely in the Black communities.
There were some, we have done wonderful work with the Oregon Black Pioneers, who we highly recommend everyone connecting with. And they did an amazing exhibit on civil rights that you can see on our website. It's called Racing to Change. And there's fascinating information there about activists in the Black community in Portland who formed their own school so that Black kids could get good education. But I noticed actually when I was looking up the Black United Fund, this week, this photo is on their homepage as well. So and they are the entity that will be working to distribute the millions of dollars that the state legislature just apportioned out, which folks may be familiar with. So still going strong in the community.
And the most prevalent minority in Oregon by far are, of course, Latinos. And it's worth remembering, people are amazed to find out this, but the California-Oregon state line, until 1848, that was the border between US and Mexico. The California-Oregon state line, I see some people nodding there that knew that. So Latinos are listed in the Oregon census as early as 1850. Many worked as vaqueros, helping with cattle drives, mule packers for the US military, but they have faced discrimination from the very start. Correct, Eliza?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Folks may be familiar that during the Depression, the United States deported 500,000 Mexican people, half of those being American citizens. So they were sent out of the country during the Depression. And yet at the same time, there were many agriculture entities and farmers who needed that stoop labor, is what they called it, because you're stooped over doing the labor. And even still during the Depression, many white folks continued to resist taking on those jobs. And so this push and pull of deporting Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Latino Americans, and then the pull of that labor desire, bringing those folks back in, which of course many people are familiar with the Bracero program during World War II that brought in laborers for railroads and farms all over the United States. So deported during the Depression, brought back in as laborers during World War II. And there are some really tragic stories about theft of wages and that kind of thing from that time period. Operation Wetback, some folks may be familiar with, were deportation sweeps during the 1950s. Those happened in Oregon. We published a really fascinating article about Southern Oregon in particular. I don't know if any of the mayors are from that region on the call, but really the work that the tree fruit co-ops in Southern Oregon did to continue to bring in bracero labor for a couple of decades. They found it reliable, and there's really interesting history of the ways that folks integrated into the community and advocated on their own behalf. And yet at the same time, there were media coverage of this Operation Wetback and really racist language about getting people out of the country. So this, again, this push and pull of labor and citizenship and political rights. Somebody noted earlier about the history of immigration in the United States, and that this idea of the right way and what's legal and illegal and the laws changing, you know, as Carrie just noted about this change in the national borders, right? A lot of times what folks will say is, I didn't cross the border crossed me, you know, and that happens in the mid-19th century here in the West. So we noted these photos because for many, many decades, Oregon Latinos have done such a powerful job of creating community organizations and political advocacy organizations for healthcare, for housing rights, that kind of thing. And of course, I don't have to tell this group, many folks are paying attention to the excess impact of COVID on farm worker communities and thinking about hygiene and housing and healthcare and that kind of thing in particular right now. So there's really strong roots of that history and just wonderful community-led organizations to turn to on that.
And then, of course, one of the most prevalent issues of today under discussion and creating protests, of course, across the country and here in Portland is the long history of police violence towards Black communities, Black populations, cooperation between police departments and white supremacist organizations. Oregon's KKK, we mentioned it very briefly, was very strong and large in the 1920s. You know, not so much aimed at the Black population because there was not a large one in Oregon, but they, of course, their discrimination, they were against Catholics, Jewish people. You know, they were very non-discriminatory in their discrimination at the KKK. But a lot of you know, long history of strife between the police and the minority population here in Oregon. You might recall, especially in the I guess was it the Burger Barn incident in '81? Eliza, was that when it was?
Yeah, yeah. That's when there were some off-duty police officers who dumped, I believe it was 4 dead opossums on the doorstep of a Black-owned restaurant here in Portland called the Burger Barn. And this is one of the incidents that's often cited as an event that further increased tension between the Black community and police officers. It's fascinating looking at the history of, you know, you see there this photo of Captain O'Dale in 1949, who ran the Red Squad in Portland in the 1930s. This was obviously an anti-communist part of the Portland Police Department. It was then integrated with groups such as the Silver Legion and the American Defenders. These were sort of proto-fascist groups that were happening around the same time. And then you see this sort of anti-communist activism. Some of you will be very familiar with this, leading into anti-Black organizing work from police departments later in the 20th century, and this police scrutiny of civil rights and anti-poverty organizations like the Black Panther Party, for example, which was setting up free breakfasts and sickle cell anemia testing and that kind of thing in Portland. And the protest here, we find it fascinating that there's this protester asking for a ban on the chokeholds, which of course is under much discussion today in local communities and nationally. And this was after Tony Stevenson was killed by Portland police in 1985. He was an off-duty security officer who was at a convenience store and helped break up a scuffle. And when the police arrived, he was the only African-American person present, I believe, and they placed him in a chokehold, and he was killed. So obviously this prompted a great deal of protest. And from the police side, there were police officers who, in a rather unwise move, I think, made T-shirts that said, "Don't choke 'em, smoke 'em," with the outline of a gun, saying, advocating for that. So you can see the long history of this tension that is coming out today.
And it was I'm holding up the OHQ again, it was the 2017 murder by a white supremacist of two citizens on the Max here in Portland who had come to the defense of minority citizens who the white supremacist was harassing, that led to this discussion that led to this issue. And the cover photo is the memorial that was done to the folks who lost their life.
So, I mean, we get a lot of questions about, well, where did this come from? Where does this protest come from? Why is this happening now? And I think it's really stunning for those of us who pay attention to history, and probably there are some folks who have lived through some of this history on the call today and say, oh, well, it's been here for a long time. And when we look at the community demands from this time period that this photo's from, they're very similar to a lot of what we see today. So it's worth taking a look at.
And then one of the more disturbing slides there is that's from a restaurant in Portland, and it was the Coon Chicken Inn.
Yeah, this is the color image. There is actually the menu that a person would be presented with going to this establishment. And this is, we just note this as an example of everyday racism. And again, thinking about those structures of white supremacy and the political structures and the economic structures that you can see so clearly in the past, and then use that vision to see where they might still be today. And then there's also these just sort of everyday cultural racism that then emphasize the dehumanization that whiteness brings out. So it's gross.
Yes.
Yeah. So then we just go back to, again, this quote that I think is helpful in thinking about these structures and then how it shows up. And so we're happy to answer questions or talk about other ideas or, other things that folks might add to this from your own communities. And I couldn't agree more. Mayor Callaway has suggested The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's a fantastic overview of redlining and does discuss Portland and really makes the argument that housing segregation is not a de facto event here in the United States, but is de jure. And so it is by law rather than just, oh, people live together. Yes, the quarterly from December is still available. You can call our museum store or just send an email. I'll put the email address here and you can order museumstore@ohs.org and ask for that white supremacy issue. They'll know the one you mean.
And one of the benefits of membership for all you new members is you'll receive the option to receive the OHQ in the mail, or you could access it online.
Yeah.
Lots of resources here at OHS. I think the next slide speaks to that. Just two of the many
of my favorites.
So.
We did a roundup a couple of months ago of a bunch of resources that we have online, mostly about Black history in Oregon. And most of those resources, I think, are Black folks in Oregon telling their own histories or scholarship, that kind of thing. And then I've really enjoyed Kimberly Crenshaw's podcast, Under the Black Light. It's a national look. And then there's one episode particularly on history, but looking at the current COVID crisis from that perspective. And folks, Kimberly Crenshaw is a scholar who developed the framework of intersectionality, right? So, which is a fancy and helpful way of thinking about the fact that nobody has a singular identity. So we have race and gender and religion and class and all these kinds of things. So it's a great one.
And OHS is open to the public now again. We were closed for several months, as many places were, and we're open now with, of course, regulations in place, the face coverings required and social distancing. The Oregon Experience, the Experience Oregon exhibit is phenomenal and worth a trip just to see that. And we also have a great temporary exhibit up now called Nevertheless They Persisted, telling the story of the 19th Amendment. This year is the centennial of women's suffrage, women getting the right to vote across the country. And Oregon, they got the right to vote a little bit earlier in 1912, but it's a great story of how these women and a few enlightened men as well led the fight to give women the right to vote. And for you soccer fans, a great new exhibit on the history of soccer in Portland, which is Go Timbers, a lot of fun.
And we never forget, of course, that it was the men of Oregon who voted to extend suffrage to women. And there's a wonderful telegraph to Abigail Scott Duniway from a national suffrage leader that says, "Long live Oregon men." So they're the ones who did the deed.
So Mayor Callaway, that we ends there. If there are questions you have or others have, I know we got a few minutes here to answer some questions if folks would like to pose them.
I have a
Sure.
question.
A couple of things. One of the questions that I received via text was, how soon will mayor's memberships be activated? And so we are, in the process of, collecting names, emails, and addresses of the mayors, and we'll be submitting them to OHS. And it's not today, but it will be very, very soon.
But you're always welcome to go to the OHS website. There's so much material there that's provided free to everybody.
Thank you.
Not just members.
Thank you. So with that, if I can have, I think Lisa, if you would open it up, unmute folks, and we'll just let people ask questions as they wish, as well as continue to access the chat feature. Thank you, both Eliza and Carrie, for doing such a great job of monitoring the chat room.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yes,
Mayor,
Rich.
please.
Yeah, Rich Mays from the Dalles. This is for Carrie. I understand that in the Oregon State Constitution vote that Oregonians voted to ban blacks by an 8-1 margin. What was the vote to allow Oregon to be a free state versus a slave state?
About 3-1.
3-1?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask Eliza a question?
Please.
Did I understand that, did you imply that the Oregon Constitution influenced the constitutions of southern states?
So there's interesting scholarship on the relations between them. And I think there's a historian, now I'm gonna forget her name, but I can send you an article that she wrote that looked at the laws in Oregon that had to do with Black sailors. So in the South, there were a lot of restrictions on free Blacks coming into the states, because they used the language of contagion, that there would be the disease of thinking about freedom or abolition. So they worked very hard to keep free Blacks out. Some of those laws were repeated in Oregon, which also worked to keep free Black sailors from leaving ships when they landed here in Oregon. And so there is some relationship, I know, between those laws, but I'm thinking that timing wise, I'm not sure about influencing the constitutions of southern states, but I think that restrictions on free Blacks, there's definitely relationship. And I'm gonna have to look up the name of this historian, and I can send it to Mayor Calloway to pass on to you because she's wrote a whole dissertation on it. And it's kind of fascinating. So,
Thank you.
yeah, sure.
I have a question. I'm Eric Neiman from Philomath, and we have a lot of history with Reuben Shipley, who was a former slave,
Yes.
helped his owner move across the Oregon Trail from Missouri to Oregon, and subsequent to that acquired some land and gave it to Mount Union Cemetery on the condition that Black people could be buried there. I guess my question would be, was it a customary practice to use slaves in that way along the Oregon Trail?
I think there were a few. That example is a fascinating one. And that case, the Holmes case of the Holmes family winning freedom for their children, which I think you may be familiar with. Yeah, the judge who decided that case is also our Judge George Williams. So who advocated for all these racist policies, but as that judge, he said, look, there's no slavery in this territory. So you cannot continue to hold these people as slaves. I think the records are not clear. So we know that there were some people who were brought here as enslaved folks. The relationships are unclear. There's a woman who came with a white man, a Black woman who came with a white man. They may have been married. She may have been enslaved. It's a little bit unclear, but we get to her story because of a court case where she was able to retain property after his death that had been taken from her. So we know that some Black folks did cross the Oregon Trail and did come, but there's very few that we have that same kind of detailed information about as we have, say, for the Holmes case. So I would say it happened, and it's important to know that Black people did come across the Oregon Trail, some free and some enslaved, but it's not a large number, would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
This is Ken.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you guys for doing what you're doing. This is very emotional and very painful to even hear for me.
Yeah.
You know, I'm one of 2 Black mayors in Oregon. Walt Williams of River Grove is the other. And it is so important for people to understand this and to understand the lasting damage that has been done to Black people in this country, you know, and it's undeniable. But to educate and for people to know more in order to do more is vitally important. The question I have, are the school systems involved in trying to get this kind of education? Because I think the younger folks really need to know this. And has there been any effort from the various school districts to engage in a level of understanding of this level of history? Because the true history is what we've just talked about. And I know that hasn't been taught, and I need to know your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We are open. OHS is open. All school tours are free, so there's no charge. You know, when school tours were happening, and hopefully when they happen again, all school tours are free here. And we also have money that provides money to schools for buses if they can't afford buses to bring kids here. And so we have a very active reach out to education and teachers across the state. And providing material and curriculum. And Eliza, you may have more on that.
Yeah, I can say that the state legislature has passed a few requirements that give us the space to help teachers with this. So there's an ethnic studies requirement that teachers in Oregon are required to teach about the contributions of a large variety of people to the state. Mm-hmm. And that Experience Oregon exhibit that Carrie talked about, we have dozens of lessons in multiple grade levels that go with that exhibit that also help teach this, and the Nevertheless They Persisted exhibit. So we are working with educators and with Oregon Department of Education to produce virtual professional development opportunities based on that curriculum and that material that we'll be doing over the next several months. and also really working to help make sure that teachers have this material so that they can use it if they are teaching at a distance. So in some ways, there's a real opportunity with everyone going virtual now that we can access that, and we're able to offer those professional development opportunities for free. What we think is that the scholarship is there, the content is there. We have so many amazing resources that teachers can use. So we're always looking for ways that we can help get that there. There's some resistance. Some teachers, of course, are not interested in teaching that history. But what we've seen is that many of them are really deeply committed to trying to get this history out to their students, and we're happy to help.
Well, there are two pieces of it. You know, they may not necessarily have comfort with teaching it, but they still need to know it. Absolutely. They still need to, in order to be able to deal with all the varieties of backgrounds that their students have, they at least need to understand it, you know, and they may not be comfortable teaching it, but that's just my opinion on this.
I have to slip away to a lunch engagement, but I'll leave Eliza here to answer a few more questions. But I do want to thank you again and give a shout out. I see that Linda McCollum, the mayor of Reedsport, is on the line. So Linda, thank you for checking in. Go Reedsport. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Carrie.
And I see Mayor Witowski is a high school government teacher. So I don't know if she's on, but maybe able to speak to how she incorporates this in her classrooms as well. So is that you waving? Hi. So.
While Beth unmutes herself, I'll mention that, you know, last, I guess it was in January of this year, my wife and I visited the Equal Justice Institute down in Montgomery, Alabama. And part of that is the Legacy Museum, where they have identified the names of every Black who has been lynched in the United States. And I went in, again, assuming that there had been no lynchings in the state of Oregon. But I was surprised to learn that in 1902, in North Bend, a gentleman by the name of Alonzo Tucker was lynched. And so it was my hope, had we been able to meet in person, but because our OMA summer conference will still be in North Bend next year, it will still be my hope that some of us as mayors will be able to go down and visit the memorial, which has now been placed within the last year there in North Bend, just to honor his life and recognize that part of our history as a state. And so I think with that, I think Beth is ready to maybe speak a little bit about you know, her experience as a high school history teacher in Dayton.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I definitely wanted to put my headset on so that you're not all listening to my toddler next to me as well. You know, one thing that I know from teaching history, government, econ, especially the last few years where things have been very passionately divisive, is, you know, a really reliable way that people have a much harder time arguing against is to use primary sources. So in my classroom, you know, we rely really, really heavily on reading primary sources and then comparing timely things. So, you know, we might read a primary document, a journal entry, for example, from folks who were involved and noted for their involvement in creating either Oregon law, Oregon history, or federal. We study the Constitution a lot. And then we'll try to find, which of course are harder, but they're there, primary documents, journal entries from people of color, from women, correspondence to those folks from their spouses, for example, things like that, to understand that sometimes, actually pretty much all of the time during those moments, you know, their words did not match the context in which they were living. So that's something that we used in my classroom just to get a really good, to hear from people who were experiencing the racism that folks believe is dead today. And then sometimes they can draw parallels. And the kids are very adept at doing that. And so when they read the experience of Abigail Adams, for example, and see how much she advised her husband, how she was respected by other soon-to-be presidents, and though she couldn't serve herself, played a huge, integral founding role in our nation. I think relying on those documents makes it indisputable, and it keeps it keeps an accurate history, and the same is true when we look at the accomplishments and the contributions of folks in BIPOC communities. There's fortunately a lot of those documents have been kept, and though they're not commonly relied upon or commonly taught, they're accessible, especially with internet access. We can find all that stuff. So that's one way that I've tried really hard to teach the complexity of some of those folks as they developed our national and Oregon history is really relying on those primary sources and seeing what folks said while things were happening.
That is music to my ears, of course. Our job at OHS is to preserve and make accessible those primary documents. So I've just put up a few websites that we have available. The WAM's website, if you're not using that yet, is amazing. And then our curriculum website. And obviously we link to a lot of primary documents and have those available. So, and if folks in your work as mayors, or I imagine that most of you are doing that as public service and hold down full-time jobs elsewhere. So, in your other work, don't hesitate to reach out to the Oregon Historical Society if there are resources or historical documents that you may need in your other work that we might be able to help send your way. Just let us know. We'd be happy to help. So thank you very much for telling us about the work you're doing with your students. That's really cool.